question, how does a city become a republic? How does a city become a free entity in a political landscape that's dominated by feudalism, as we know and tend to assume most of the pre-industrial past was? Today we're going to talk about the city of Strasbourg, which became one of the most beautiful cities in the world and remains so to this day, and was for several centuries independent and autonomous republic. We're going to look at the birth of that republic and how they won their freedom from their bishop in a battle of the 13th century. Before we get there, of course, if you've listened to any of my videos, you know that we got to get into a little bit of context, a little bit of setup, a little bit of background. Cities evolved very differently in different parts of Europe. This is one of the key factors that makes this whole thing about the city-states and the free cities so confusing to a lot of people. The nature of cities in Italy and in Central and Northern Europe was very different from those in the far western kingdoms that we're more familiar with, such as England, France, and Castile in what is now Spain. Cities throughout Europe increased dramatically in economic and cultural importance during the High Medieval period, which is roughly from the 1100 to about 1300. Some people call this the first or early Renaissance, the pre-Renaissance. There was a bunch of improvements in some key technologies, that some of which are fairly well known. You probably read about, the three-field system and maybe the transition into using horses to pull plows, using iron plowshares and things like that. But there was a lot more to it than that. There was a whole lot of little small things that mostly common people figured out in various parts of Europe, which led, among other things, to a really big population explosion they were having throughout this period. It was a boom time. There was, setbacks, and there were famines and all kinds of things that happened. But in general, the population really increased and urbanization increased. Cities during the migration era, after the fall of the Roman Empire, cities had been on the decline. They started coming together again in the Carolingian era, during the rule of Charlemagne and his other members of his family. But it was in this era that it really started breaking open. And the reaction to this process was mixed, because on the one hand, this meant that there was a lot more money coming in and a lot more technological innovation that could be really useful for your warlords that were nominally or fully in charge, depending on what part of Europe you're talking about. But it was also, the rise of the city was a challenge to the authority of the princely rulers, the kings and the dukes and the some of the ecclesiastical rulers, the bishops and so on, who were the overlords for these various regions. And some of them reacted with violence. So in France, for example, the monarchy joined forces with the Pope, or kind of arguably pressured the Vatican to become part of a crusade against cities in the southern part of France, what's called Languedoc. There were some people that lived in this part of France, which was going through a big surge of cultural development and music and poetry, but also technology and money and increasing population. There were some people down there that were called Cathars or Albigensians, who were considered Gnostic heretics. Some people would say they're not Gnostic, but they were a variation on the Christian model, let's say, that was considered unacceptable by the church. And there weren't that many Albigensians probably down in this region, but there were enough of them, and the local authorities, the local regional princes and the towns were tolerant of them. They didn't try to root them out or kill them, and that was either the reason, or depending on your perspective, the excuse for the King of France to go down to that part of the south of France and pretty much destroy all these towns and really knock them back, which probably is maybe the reason why the Renaissance happened in a later period and not in France to start with. In Lombardy, in northern Italy, the cities were also surging in economic dynamism and cultural innovation, and they were starting to assert themselves, and they were starting to defy their feudal overlords and just make their own decisions, and they were actually sort of getting involved in little wars, and all kinds of things were going on. And their theoretical overlord was the Holy Roman Emperor, who's we often consider kind of like the king of Germany, but it's a little more complex than that. So this was the emperor of what we mostly today what we think of as Northern Europe, but who also extended his authority down into the northern parts of Italy. And as these towns started becoming more assertive and also really a lot richer, so not only did he not want them making their own decisions and forming their own alliances and getting involved in treaties with other foreign powers that maybe he didn't even like, or he might have himself have been at war with, but he wanted a little more control over the flow of cash, because these cities were bringing incredible amounts of wealth coming down the Silk Road. They had trade networks that were reaching across the Mediterranean, that were reaching into the Middle East and all the way into the Far East. Marco Polo made it all the way to China in the 13th century. So the amount of money that was coming in as a result of that, and the amount of money that was flowing into Italy because of the emerging technology of banking, were all very tempting to these really powerful warlords, which is what the Holy Roman Emperor was. So starting already in the 12th century, there started to break out battles and feuds and wars between the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Emperors of this princely family called the Hohenstaufen, versus a bunch of the towns in northern Italy. And in this case, the Pope usually sided with the towns as well. So you had the Pope kind of on the town side. And the towns formed a alliance called the Lombard League. In Italian, they call it the Lega Lombarda in 1167. So in the third quarter of the 12th century. And this continued all the way through to the middle of the 13th century. There was a bunch of bloody, destructive wars. Several cities were sacked. Some of them were almost completely destroyed. Many people were killed. The countryside was devastated. The Holy Roman Emperors were coming down into this region and marching their armies around and then fighting until they ran out of money. Going back, they would have negotiations, and the negotiations would fall apart and they would invade again. So by the middle of the 13th century, in the 1240s, the emperor was a guy called Frederick II, who was known as Barbarossa, which just means the red beard, who was fighting just a pitched battle with the Lombard League, with all these towns in the Lombard League. And this war had been going on for a long time, and the popularity of all the fighting going on in Italy was straining the family diplomatic connections back in central and northern parts of Europe. In the 1240s, Frederick Barbarossa started having some problems. He was having other princely families were contesting his rights as emperor back in the German-speaking regions, which divided his attention. Back in Italy, he lost a big battle at Parma in 1248, where he lost his standard and a lot of his treasure. And then his son, Enzo of Sardinia, was captured by Bolognese militia in 1249 at the Battle of Fossalta, which he had some other sons. This was his legitimate heir, though. And then finally, the next year, Emperor Barbarossa himself, who had gotten ill during a siege, died probably of dysentery in a monastery in 1250. His son, who had been placed in golden chains by the citizens of Bologna, was firmly imprisoned and ended up dying in 1272, which basically meant that this Hohenstaufen dynasty ended. And the reason all this matters for Strasbourg, you might be wondering, is because this caused a huge disruption in all of sort of Central and Northern Europe, which is called the Great Interregnum by modern historians. So an interregnum just means between reigns, between Prince or King A and Prince or King B. And interregnums are probably the number one problem with monarchies, because even if you get lucky and you have a King Solomon or Marcus Aurelius, running your kingdom, as soon as that person gets ill or dies, you then have to figure out who the next person is going to be. And the roll of the dice says that quite often it may not be another Marcus Aurelius or Caesar Augustus. It could just as easily be Caligula or Nero or Tiberius. And everybody knows that. And the people that are closest to power are the ones that are most at risk when you get a really bad leadership. It may not matter that much to a peasant somewhere, hundreds or thousands of miles from wherever the seats of power are. And whether it matters to a town can really depend on a lot of different things. But for the members of these great princely houses and the members of the family of the last king and the courtiers and a lot of the other warlords and generals and military people and people important in the church, they all had their favored candidates, and they all were very worried about certain other candidates. They didn't want, it's a little bit like we have a lot of concern when we have election time in some of our modern societies today, but it's much more severe of an issue in a monarchy because the king has a lot of power. And in this case, in the Great Interregnum, this interregnum, which had become chaotic and violent as they sometimes did, lasted an enormously long time. It lasted 27 years. It already started before the death of Barbarossa in 1246 because, as I said, some of the princely families were contesting his rule. And it lasted all the way until 1273. And what this meant is that as the great princely families were fighting and maneuvering and filing lawsuits and sometimes having little truces and treaties and then going back to war again and again and having all their creating all this chaos, there was nobody to do the job of the emperor. The job of the emperor in the Holy Roman Empire, which was a somewhat loosely governed state to begin with, was basically to be the top level judge or arbitrator that was supposed to kind of keep the peace between his major subjects. And his major subjects would be like noble families, groups of knights sometimes, and some of these cities, and also the various ecclesiastical rulers that had power in his regions. Now, this is something that was contested by the Pope, like how much authority does the king or the Holy Roman Emperor in this case have over a prelate? But the facts were that within the German-speaking areas, the Holy Roman Emperor did have authority over them generally. And what that in turn meant, because there was no arbitrator anywhere, there was nobody to say, hey, look, you got to chill out. You're pushing too far. You're going to start a regional war if you keep this up, etc. A lot of these little regional disputes started getting out of control. There was nobody to settle the disputes, so the bullies could start preying on the weak. And in some cases, the weak could start banding together to overthrow the bullies or overthrow the stronger party. And this is kind of what started happening along the Rhineland, not just in Strasbourg, but for several towns in the Rhineland during the Great Interregnum. There were disputes between the warlords and the princely rulers and towns. And one version of the princely rulers that they had in this region were bishops. So there was these really powerful bishops in the Holy Roman Empire who were among what became the prince electors. These were like the top handful of families that just would decide who the next emperor was going to be. And one of the most powerful bishoprics was the Bishop of Strasbourg. The Bishop of Strasbourg was also nominally the prince who was in charge of that city. And Strasbourg, being on a major trade artery and being a well-organized town, had been feuding with their overlord, the bishop, for several generations. And they basically just didn't want to be run from outside of the town. They didn't want to be overly taxed. They didn't want interference with their trade. They didn't want to be blocked from having, friendly relations with some of the neighboring powers, like say France or the Low Countries up, which is now Belgium and Holland. And they didn't necessarily want to participate in every little feud or war that the bishop was involved in, which was all the time because he was essentially a prince, even though in theory he's a man of God. In reality, this guy's a warlord who's from one of these minor princely families in Central Europe. In order to create a little more stability, what these towns were already starting to do was that gradually over time, through strategic use of bribes and loans, and by doing military service or sending troops or hiring mercenaries to participate sometimes in the feudal conflicts, they would get special rights. And there was in this period, all the rights and responsibilities that we think of a citizen having versus a government having were kind of separate, and this is part of the definition of the medieval estate. Which responsibilities did you have? Which rights did you have? So the towns would more or less buy or negotiate, like, hey, we'll send 1,000 guys to help you in this battle with your cousin, but we want the right to make our own weights and measures. And then kind of have the guy over a barrel because he needs their help. So he'll say, okay, sure, fine, I'll give you weights and measures. And then next time they want the right to judge certain kinds of crimes. There's separate rights to judge different kinds of crimes, or the right to send representatives to other nations. I want to be able to go send my diplomats to other countries. Or a really important one was the right to build walls. There's bandits around here. There's robber knights. There's roaming foreign armies. We need walls to protect our community, and the right to keep a permanent armed militia, which is a big one, and the right to mint coins and all kinds of other stuff. There's dozens of these. And each time they won a new right like that, they would write it down in their town charter, and they would keep a document with the seal of the bishop or whatever other prince granted them the right in their chest. And this was very sacred to these towns. So it was a lot like the Constitution in the United States, or the Magna Carta in England or something, which is from also around the same time. And the bishops didn't like this because sometimes they'd say, well, you got that right under duress, or you got that right from my cousin and he was kind of stupid. And I don't agree with that. And so every time there was a new bishop, a lot of times there would be a period of conflict between the bishops and the towns. And the bishops wanted to claw these rights back, and the towns would assert themselves. And they usually were planning ahead. Another thing about the towns is that you had a little bit more of a continuity of leadership, because it was the leadership of the town was a committee. It was a council. So people would die and new people would join the council, but there was sort of an overall a collective agenda, let's say, and for them, their agenda was the further autonomy of the town and the prosperity and well-being of the town. Whereas for the princely rulers, these bishops, they would be involved in all kinds of things and not necessarily even thinking about the town that much quite often. So the net result was usually that the bishops would look at the town and say, okay, I'm getting a certain amount of money from this town, and the town offers me certain benefits. So I'm going to tolerate the town. But in this case, during the Great Interregnum, we had a guy called Walter von Geroldseck, who was personally, he's one of my favorite ever bishops, not necessarily because of any profound theological or philosophical writings that he made or anything like that, but because he's got his own action figure, as you can see here. I don't know why he has an action figure. I was not able to figure that out, but actually I was able to find two different action figures for this guy. And I'm sure it's because of the somewhat fame of this battle, at least in certain parts of the world, really mainly in Alsace. I don't think it's that well known anywhere else, but somebody made action figures for this guy because he was a warlike bishop. And that's kind of an interesting, again, a little bit counterintuitive for the modern thinker, the idea that bishops would go and fight wars. But that was a very common thing. So von Geroldseck was a bishop, mostly just in the name. He was probably not a super pious fellow. He was a feudal warlord. And in fact, when he came into power during the Great Interregnum, it's like there's no real king up above us all to kind of force us to stick to whatever the old arrangements were. He also declared himself to be a duke. And he wanted to claw back all the rights that the town had, that Strasbourg had. It's in general, towns and feudal rulers had somewhat divergent agendas. The town wanted to trade, they wanted to make things to sell, and to develop their own internal space to be a really beautiful and safe place to live, which most of the towns in Central Europe did accomplish to a large extent, which is why they generate billions of dollars in tourist revenue to this day. And Strasbourg is definitely no exception to that. It's a really, really beautiful city, especially the older part of town, which is mostly, I think, most of what's left is like 17th century, but there's still some 16th and a little bit of 15th century architecture, including the giant cathedral there. And all of that is just really just breathtaking. It's really striking. And it's a testament to the efforts over centuries of these people that live in these places to make them nicer and nicer and nicer. which they got very good at. The towns usually wanted to avoid wars, although they would fight if they needed to in order to kind of keep their primary goals alive of staying prosperous and free. And they were definitely not interested in getting involved in all of the feuds that the princes were constantly in with each other. The noble, conversely, would usually look at the town and see it as a place where you could get nice things. So, including things like weapons and armor that the towns tended to be a little bit ahead of the feudal world on. So, whereas the knights are involved in all their world of the court and the tournament and the balls and the hunt and everything like that, the towns were constantly innovating and they were making new weapons. So if you wanted the best type of armor, the best type of siege weapons, the best sword, the best new devious things like firearms that were just starting to appear in the 13th century, gunpowder and all that, the town was the place that you could get those things. The town was also a place you could get luxuries, very nice fabrics. You could get silk that was brought all the way from China. A lot of the princely nobles didn't know where China was, but some of the towns did know where it was. The Italians were going all the way there, and they certainly had trade networks that were going to towns like Strasbourg where you could get that stuff and spices and pepper and all that. The town was also a place where a prince like the Bishop Walter von Geroldseck could hire skilled masons. Like if you want to have a castle and you are a warlord, you probably have some people working for you, but the real experts that can build like the new type of castle that's going to be the latest state of the art, which you really want if you don't want your castle to get taken over, you want to go to a town like Strasbourg because they're going to have a masons guild there, and they're going to have very good masons. And it's also like a port of embarkation. If you wanted to go, let's say he wants to go participate in a tournament in England, or he wants to go somewhere. He wants to go to Sweden, or he wants to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. You're going to get in a boat probably and go down a river and then out into sea, and that's all going to happen through the towns. And then finally, of course, the town is a cash cow. So that the town, like for a noble, they are theoretically very rich, but their land is tied up in land. It's tied up in a bunch of farmers' fields. It's in the wheat and the rye and the linen and with all the wool in the sheep, and a lot of that it becomes available during harvest time, but it's not ready cash. It's not like you could just go to the bank and say, hey, I want my $250,000 worth of wool right now. It's like, sorry man, you got to wait till November. That's when we shear the sheep. Their wealth was not as liquid. And frankly, it was just dwarfed by the time you get into the mid 13th century. These towns were creating all these new things. They were trading very long distances, and they had things that nobody even thought of before. You had things like, you wanted to suddenly you had the ability to put glass in windows. You have spectacles. You want to be able to keep. All kinds of amazing new things are coming out. And so the towns, as a result, were really very wealthy. They were much more wealthy than a lot of these noble families were. So the temptation to squeeze them for more and more money was really hard to resist, especially for these princely families because they were always fighting each other, and because they were always like borrowing money and getting involved in debt because they had to finance wars and they had to ransom their people. And so forth, and they had to pay for very fancy weddings and everything so they could look good to their peers. They were always in dire need of money. So it's really not at all surprising that the town and the bishops would clash. But in this case, the clash got really out of hand. And the bishop said, look, the emperor's not around right now, and I am saying that I'm taking over. And the town said, well, we're saying no. And so this meant that they were going to really go to war. It wasn't just going to be the usual feud where there's a little bit of raiding here and there and some lawsuits and so on. This was really going to get serious. And so what ended up happening was the bishop got together all the forces that he could, and he started basically put an embargo on the town. He surrounded the town, and he started stopping the caravans that were coming in to and fro and just taking whatever they had, and blocking the commerce that was the sort of lifeblood of the city. Some trade was still apparently getting through along the Rhine, along the river, but the embargo was fairly effective, and the town was somewhat caught off guard when he declared that he was like revoking all their rights. They had not stored up a bunch of supplies, so they weren't really ready for a very long siege. And the bishop was taking advantage, which was also very typical in this time, of his superiority in cavalry. The feudal warlords had good cavalry. They had the heavy cavalry, and they also had usually light cavalry too. So in this case, according to the sources, he had 60 lances, which would probably be about 300 or 400 actual riders. Each lance is going to be controlled by a knight or a man-at-arms, and then each one of these fellows is supported by a handful of other not quite as heavily armed guys. And then he had 5,000 infantry, which were probably mostly peasant levy, and we know he did have some mercenaries, some professionals. The town appears to have only had 10 lances, which would be about 50 horsemen of heavy cavalry. And these guys are what are called Konstaffler. They were from these little cavalry societies inside of the town. They were basically the equivalent of knights. Most of them would be from the wealthier merchant families. And they may have had about 50 to 100 light cavalry. They had about 2,000 infantry, which is considerably less than the bishop, but these would be the militia from the town. These are citizens who would be required to, in order to get your citizenship, you were required to own some armor of a certain standard, probably, a breastplate or mail shirt, a helmet. Probably in this era, in the 13th century, they probably had shields. The most important part of this, though, was that 300 of these infantry were skilled marksmen. And this is another interesting facet of this, is that in this period, this is just when a beginning of a sport and a kind of a sport, warlike sport or military sport festival called the Schützenfest had started up in Central Europe. And these were contests where people would get together. I think they started out informally, and then we started having very formal ones that were coming together right around this time period. But we know that the sport of shooting, which gradually starts off really just for prestige, but gradually becomes, like, over time, becomes, a moneymaker. These people became like professional athletes. And this is just starting at this point. So I'm not really certain to what extent, but it does seem that there's some culture of sport shooting going on, and that these marksmen certainly appeared in the battle to be a little more capable than what everybody was expecting, or certainly what the bishop was expecting. But the town was outnumbered, and they didn't have the cavalry. They didn't have as many infantry either, and they didn't have a lot of supplies laid in. So they were going to be forced to have to fight a pitched battle. And in this period, in the 13th century, we are on for quite a long period of time where the vast majority of cases, the cavalry would defeat infantry in the open, especially cavalry led by a warlord, a nobleman, would win against any kind of commoners. And if you were involved in a rebellion against your betters in the aristocratic feudal hierarchy, usually that meant that if you lost, you could expect to be really, really brutally treated. You were going to suffer from reprisals. Like, there was going to be atrocities committed against the women and the children. There was going to be brutal executions for the leadership and a lot of the fighting people that were involved in the uprising. This is what usually happened. But in this case, these people felt that they had no choice but to fight this militia. So use their militia to fight the bishop. So they prepared very carefully, and they made a plan. They started forming alliances with some other Alsatian towns, and this may have been the nucleus of what eventually became a special town league in the region called the Decapole. Although one of my friends debates me whether the Decapole even existed, but certainly there were temporary alliances between a lot of the towns in Alsace. And they also made an alliance with a regional count who was from an up-and-coming noble family called the Hausbergs. And this count was a much lower-ranked nobleman than the bishop was, but he did have this authority of a princeling. And so the town declared a feud against their bishop. They put out a feud letter, and we actually have the letter that they wrote, and they said, we are throwing our lot in with this other knight, and we think he's a better. They called him a young Herr, like a Junker. He's a better prince than you are, and we don't want to be with you anymore. And basically, that's all it says. And this was part of the legal process of declaring a feud, which meant the war would be legal, at least according to certain criteria. And they would actually write this out, this feud note on a card, and ride around with it, and maybe go pin it to the door of a church. So to counter the town, the bishop made also some alliances, and he made a treaty with the Bishop of Trier and with the abbots in St. Gall and Murbach, and they provided him 1,500 more troops. So now his army is even bigger. And he brought his forces up to the vicinity. He brought the entirety of his army up into the vicinity of the city on the west bank of the Rhine, near this little place called Hausbergen, on the 8th of March in 1262. As an aside, this is a depiction of the Strasbourg militia from a later period. This is from the 14th century. You can see how the infantry are riding on carts, and each infantry group on a cart is organized under a guild banner. So you can kind of see there's like shearers and coopers and so on. Whereas the Constaffler, who are the young men from the wealthy merchant families, are on horseback. Each one of them is under a family coat of arms. So the patriciate in the towns, which were the wealthy merchants mostly, were kind of the equivalent of nobles, but you got to be really careful about. People tend to lump them in together. They're really not the same thing. These people, generally, over time, they really came to look down on the aristocracy. So for the battle, we have some more images. These are not from the period. They're not from the Middle Ages, but they're really wonderful. They were created as a comic book by the University of Strasbourg to commemorate the 750th anniversary of this battle back in 2012. So you'll see a bunch of those pictures as we go through what happened in the battle. And I want to thank those people for having created these wonderful comic images, which I would say are they're in the ballpark of probably what everything looked like. I mean, I'm not going to say it's clinically accurate, but it's at least in the ballpark. It's not as bad as a typical. Sorry to say this, but it's not as bad as a typical Hollywood or BBC type movie on anything medieval would be. Anyway, so the towns sends out. They divide their army into different forces, and one of the things that we know from some later books of war, I was talking to my friend Philip Martins about this. That they would organize the armies according to not only according to the equipment and level of training, but also to the age and the personality type of the troops. So you'd have like the more impetuous troops, which will often be the younger, but not only the younger. The people that were a little bit, like quick to anger would be in one group, and the people that were a little more patient would be in another group, and so on, which I think is super interesting. But clearly, these were very carefully picked groups. They sent 700 guys, which included most of their cavalry, which was only like 50 horses, to this little town called Mundelsheim, which was just a very small, technically it was a town, but essentially this was like a little market village that was about 10 kilometers north of what was then Strasbourg and is today within the city limits, I think, of the city. And there was a little church on the hill, which was called Hausbergen Hill. And the burghers had been watching the bishop's men, because they have these towers and church cathedral or church steeples in the town. They don't have the big cathedral yet, but they have these, they had churches, and they would put people high up in the steeples, and very carefully they had been studying the bishop's forces. And they saw that this little town was a control center that the bishop's men were using to enforce the embargo. So they charged up to this hill and they stormed the little town, and the garrison rang the church bell before they were overrun. So the Bishop von Geroldseck knew that the Strasbourg militia were on the move. So he started bringing his army forward, which started out with his heavy cavalry, his knights. The Strasbourg commander was a guy called Reinbold Liebenzaler, and he was with this force of 700 guys. He sent some riders back to Strasbourg itself to let them know that he could see the bishop's men were coming from his vantage up here on the top of the hill. And at this time, the city the rest of the militia and leadership that were in the city had already seen the bishop's forces were starting to move from their steeples. So they open the gates and send their second force out, which is under the command of another guy called Nicholas Zorn. And so he leads a column of 1,200 men who are coming at double time march to reinforce their buddies. Reinhold Liebenzahl, the original, the commander of the first group of Strasbourg militia, deploys his forces in the village of, or the little town of Hausbergen. And von Geroldseck sends his cavalry to stop them from getting there. And they're expecting to see that the Burger militia are going to just run when they see the heavy cavalry coming, because they're mostly on foot. And, you know, if you let the cavalry get close enough, then you're not going to have any choice but to fight, and you're not going to have the option of running away because the horse can run you down. But this time, the Strasbourg forces did not retreat. They were situated for a battle, and so von Geroldseck's men were a little bit surprised that these guys were ready to fight. Probably to buy some time, one of the handful of knights that were with the Strasbourg forces, which was a guy called Marcus of Eckersheim, who became known as the Hetzer or the Harasser, came up. He rode up with his banner and he challenged the forces of the bishops to a single combat. And this was a very common thing. Battlefield dueling was pretty normal in this period and continued all the way up into the 15th century. So a knight from the bishop's army named Beckelar came forward with his banner and accepted the challenge. So while the two armies watched, the two knights jousted each other, or I should say the urban guy was probably a constaffler, but these two horsemen jousted. Both of them were unhorsed. But then as the other cavalry and infantry elements ran forward in a not very chivalrous follow-up to the battlefield duel, Eckersheim was rescued by the Strasbourg militia, but Beckelar was killed. So then the forces formed up, and the bishop's cavalry, angered at the death of their mate, charged in, and the Burger infantry met them. The fighting was very fierce. We know that there's a mention that the Burger infantry had some long spears, but the main weapon that the Chronicle mentions is what it calls Danish axes, which might have been a little bit like a early halberd, but some kind of big two-handed axes. And they've been told to just chop, 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 chop. And their goal was to take down the horses. This is one of the things they've been told to do as the bishop's cavalry got close. And the Strasbourg militia was initially back on their heels. They were being pushed back a little bit, but then as the battle starts getting intense and they look like they might break, the second reinforcing group arrives from Strasbourg, the other 1,200 guys. And part of this second group was the 300 picked marksmen with the crossbows. And Zorn, who was the other Strasbourg leader, leads them to a blocking position on the right flank of the fight. So at this point, it's the bishop's heavy cavalry, his knights, are engaged with the Strasbourg forces, but his infantry have not gotten there yet. So there's still about 5,000 infantry that are coming up. And as they start advancing toward the battle, the crossbowmen start just shooting volleys of quarrels at them. And then these guys were trained so that out of the 300 guys, you might have 100 shooting and the other 200 are loading. So they're just shooting, and then another volley of another 100 goes out, and then another volley. And so it's like more or less keeping a continuous rain of bolts coming down. And crossbows had been advancing very quickly in this period, and these were maybe a little more powerful weapons than everybody was used to. The city, again, is at the leading edge of technology, and these guys they were already probably involved in this shooting sport, and it seemed to have had an unexpectedly large impact. In fact, the army of 5,000 men was unable to connect with their cavalry to back up their knights, and they ended up falling back. And according to the Chronicles, which is the Chronicles friendly to the point of view of the town, but it claims that these guys lost 1,200 people. probably meaning both wounded and killed. So then the rest of the Strasbourg infantry joined with their friends and attacked the bishop's cavalry in their flank. And this started to cause a rout because the guys with the axes were hitting the horses. The guys with the crossbows were also shooting the horses. And the riders were protected by armor, but this was not the sort of armor that you would have seen in the 15th century. A lot of these guys are at least partly relying on mail, and it's not necessarily completely invulnerable. There's not their coverage of their body may not be of their entire body. Anyway, the fighting was very fierce. The Bishop Walter von Geroldseck was unhorsed twice. Both times his horse was killed. His brother Hermann von Geroldseck was unhorsed and killed. He was pulled off his horse and somebody got him. And he also lost another 60 knights, according to the Chronicle, with another 86 being captured. In essence, his entire cavalry force was routed. Now, these numbers, I'm slightly suspicious of the numbers because what it might actually mean is that it was 60 horsemen that were killed and 86 horsemen captured, which would mean 12 knights and 17 or 18 captured, something like that. But regardless, it was a significant number of his key people. Geroldseck was put on a third horse and managed to ride away to a nearby town called Molsheim. But he lost an incredible amount of face and a lot of support and a lot of his assets. And he renounced his rights over the city, and then he died a year later. According to the Chronicle, again, it's somewhat suspect. This is a friendly to the town source, but the townfolk claim that they only lost one person. They claim again that they had killed 60 nobles. That might have been actually 60 nobles. It might have just been just the horsemen, and that they captured 86 people, which they definitely did capture 86 people. These were people who were ransomed later. And they claim that they killed another 1,300 infantry. Mostly were from that force of reinforcements that were driven off by the crossbowmen. So we don't really know how much of these numbers are creative bookkeeping, so to speak, but the outcome was very real. So the town of Strasbourg then negotiated a truce with the bishop's brother, the former bishop's brother, after he died, whose name was Henry von Geroldseck, and they ransomed the captives back to their families, and in turn they were granted the status of a free imperial city. Strasbourg remained a free imperial city and became a republic, and this continued for 418 years until they were taken over by the King of France in 1681, which is another story for another time. So this is a pretty important battle, even in terms of military history, because it was a case where an army that was mostly infantry defeated a heavy cavalry army, which happened here about a generation before the three battles that were usually taught. If you've ever studied military history, you've probably heard of the battles of Golden Spurs or Courtrai in Flanders at 1302, and Bannockburn in Scotland in 1314, and Morgarten in Switzerland, which I have a little video about, in 1315. Those are considered usually the turning point when infantry started being able to, overcome horsemen or heavy cavalry. And even that is not entirely true, because there's many battles that took place after those three where the horsemen annihilated infantry forces. But it does show that already before those three battles, there were starting to be cases where a well-organized infantry army could defeat the heavy cavalry even out in the open. And it just tells us that, rather than pivotal events and pivotal people being so influential and so dramatically changing the world in a matter of just a day or something, which sometimes happens, but a lot of times it's more of a gradual process. Generally speaking, I think this story was something we missed in our understanding of history and our overview, a lot of which we get from Victorian historians and historians from earlier period, from the 18th century, but from a very selected point of view. And those people were getting the histories that were, popular, all the way back to the Enlightenment, that were being kind of pre-filtered by people who worked for absolute monarchs and who worked for, people that were in princely families. They don't really necessarily want to read about commoners winning victories, and until they had to. Golden Spurs was such a shocking turnabout that it had to be noted. But a lot of these smaller events are kind of skipped, especially the ones that have to do with the towns, because we don't really look at history from the point of view of these urban communities, even though they were really important, because so much of the technology and the art and the philosophy and the culture that made our society what it is doesn't come from kings. The kings didn't invent or create all that. It came from artisans and common people and merchants and people that were in these little urban spaces that are so beautiful to look at to this day. And the rise of infantry was definitely a sort of a gradual and halting process. It went forward and backward. It did not, cavalry also improved. Cavalry figured out how to deal with the new tactics and the new weapons that the infantry was using. And, you could say that this process already was starting with the birth of the Lombard League in the 12th century, and it continued through the great triumphs of the Swiss Confederacy in the 15th century. But it was never complete or absolute, because you still have really important heavy cavalry all the way up until the 17th century with the Poles saving Vienna. So it's complicated. Military history is complicated, but this is the cunning victory in battle that was won by the community of Strasbourg and the people of Strasbourg, whose names have come down to us through history and through his wonderful French comic book. By the way, French comic books, in my opinion, some of the world's best. They do baking very well, they do wine very well, and I love their comic books too. And I don't really generally like comic books. But yeah, heavy cavalry never stopped being dangerous for a really long time. But militias of these towns started to become something that people had to pay attention to. They had advantages in armor and weapons and their engineering skills and their abilities in siege warfare. Whereas the aristocracy often had some of the best military leaders and the tactical flexibility that really good cavalry could give you. But of course, they in turn had to face, the cavalry of the steppe. Anyway, hope you like this story, and I hope you one day have a chance to go visit Strasbourg, because it is an incredibly beautiful city, and it's got a lot of secrets and a lot of treasures to delve into. And I will have some more on Strasbourg coming up, because their military history continues to be very interesting too. But for now, that's gonna be it for this one, and hope you liked it, and I hope you come and check out the next one.